From the deepest part, from the military and patriotic pride of the land, where it was better to die in battle than to return home defeated, a man was born who would live to become the greatest embodiment of his people's warrior philosophy. Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 soldiers at Thermopylae undertook a feat that elevated them to historical mythology. With his martyrdom defying the immense power of the church, King Leonidas rose to the rank of hero and helped save Greek civilization from subjugation by the East. Leonidas embodied laconicism, self-sacrificing discipline, physical strength, and the calling to martyrdom that characterized the Spartan citizen. Today we will discover his complete story up until his final moment. I'm Reynaldo Carrillo, and this is the New Encyclopedia. And I invite you to leave your comments, to like this video, to share it with your friends, and to support us on our Patreon, which you can find below in the comments. Leonidas was born around 540 before Christ in the Greek city of Sparta. At that time, Greece was made up of hundreds of city-states that shared a common culture, of which Athens and Sparta were the largest and most powerful. During these centuries, the Greek peoples achieved greatness not only in maritime and commercial matters, but also in the arts, sciences, philosophy, education, and political thought. This golden age of ancient Greek man would leave a cultural and political mark on the Roman Empire and would become one of the pillars of future Christian and Western civilization. Leonidas was the son of Anaxandridas, king of Sparta. For the Greeks of that time, war was the supreme proclamation of a citizen. The ability for war was what made a man and what gave him the right to be part of his city. All Greek citizens in all the city-states were required to perform military service from a young age. And even so, Sparta was a special case among them, a city that had already become a military power before the birth of Leonidas. Spartan society revolved around military virtue and war. The sovereignty and freedom of the city were only possible through a strong warrior people and military excellence. It was the center of their philosophy, their education, and their way of life, which, as a complement to their military stoicism, was also rich in arts and music. The poet Tyrtaeus expressed this Spartan morality very well. Quote, "It is beautiful to die in the front line as a brave man fighting for his homeland." These were the most feared soldiers in Greece. To prepare for this life as a warrior, Spartan boys were separated from their families and sent at the age of 7 to a strict military training camp known as the Agoge. There, they were instilled with a warrior worldview for the greater good of Sparta, along with intense physical preparation. There was only one exception to this mandatory military training: the firstborn son of the king of each city-state. His upbringing was special and focused on preparing him for the power he would inherit after his father's death. However, this did not apply to Leonidas, who was Anaxandrides' fourth son. His older half-brother, Cleomenes I, was first in line to be the next king of Sparta. Because of this, Leonidas spent his formative years in the strict Agoge, learning how to become a Spartan warrior and filling himself with that philosophy of martyrdom. In this harsh training regime, they were especially taught wrestling, athletics, and weapons handling. They were also taught reading, writing, and singing. They were taught rigor, discipline, and blind obedience to their leaders. Future soldiers were not allowed to wear shoes because it was believed that jumping and running could be done more quickly barefoot. The boys were also only allowed to wear a single cloak throughout the year, to force them to get used to scorching summers and freezing winters, so that they would learn to manage with the little coverage they had. On the other hand, the food for the boys was strictly rationed, under the belief that a thin and hungry man fought much more effectively than a fat and satisfied one. In addition, being able to go a long time without food would make them better prepared warriors for the hardships of war. Leonidas would train with the best in the city. In addition to this, the Spartans earned a reputation as men of learning who loved music, poetry, and dancing. At the age of 18, Leonidas was already an agile and ready man for battle, a military machine full of confidence, ferocity, and discipline. It was also around this time that Leonidas married the daughter of his half-brother Cleomenes. Her name was Gorgo, and according to all historical records, she was a beautiful and politically astute woman. While all this was happening, in Persia, where the state of Iran is located today, a powerful empire was being consolidated that had already expanded through much of southern Asia and was planning to invade the cities of ancient Greece. This empire sent several envoys to the Greek cities demanding their submission to Persia. Many of them succumbed without resistance to the military might of this Persian empire. However, Athens judged and executed these Persian envoys, and in Sparta they were thrown into a well. This led to a first attempt by the Persians to invade the Greek cities that did not submit, but this invasion failed. The king of Sparta, seeing that several Greek cities were falling due to the cowardice of their leaders, devoted himself to gathering a formidable army in the surrounding territories. But as a result of various political intrigues that have never been clarified, the king of Sparta, Anaxandrides, ended up being imprisoned by the Spartan nobility itself. It is believed that Leonidas may have been involved in this conspiracy. The imprisoned king managed to persuade one of his captors to lend him a dagger. With it, apparently, he committed a gruesome suicide, cutting himself to pieces from his feet upwards. So Cleomenes, the firstborn, now became the king of Sparta. His older half-brother, Doriago, was outraged. Realizing he couldn't remain in Sparta, he attempted to form a colony in Africa. When this failed, he went to Sicily, where he met an early death. Eventually, King Cleomenes would also pass away in the year 490 before Christ, so Leonidas was next in line for the throne. Leonidas rises in the midst of the heat of conflict in this difficult situation that threatened to subjugate all of Greek civilization to the Persian Empire. For years, the Persians had been gathering a huge army for a second invasion. And finally, in 480 before Christ, they set out en masse to conquer the city-states that continued to resist them. This invasion started the Greco-Persian Wars. Quick action was needed, and Leonidas proved to be the right man to get it done. The goal of the Persians was to absorb the Greeks into their empire. They already ruled several Greek coastal cities in Asia. The existence of other Greek city-states that could still fight was a beacon of hope for those that had already been subdued, the only hope for them to regain their independence. King Xerxes was determined to crush all Greek resistance, so he gathered a giant force of 1,200 warships and up to 1,700,000 warriors. In stark contrast, the Greeks had neither as many warriors nor the same level of cohesion that the Persian Empire showed at that time. Out of more than 100 Greek city-states, only 31 had agreed to stand up and fight against the Persians. The kings of these 31 states gathered and swore to fight against the Persians and punish any city that switched to the enemy's side. Several key states, such as Thessaly and Boeotia, had surrendered to Persia, which had not encountered resistance until reaching the city of Athens. So the Spartans took command of the war effort of the cities that had refused to surrender their sovereignty. Sparta was acknowledged by other city-states as the moral, political, and especially military leader, with the power to spearhead the resistance in Greece. Faced with the imminent invasion, a Spartan delegation consulted the Oracle of Delphi, and it predicted that Sparta would be destroyed unless it sacrificed the life of a king in its defense. Under the reign of Leonidas, the Spartans were determined to fight, conquer, or die. The alliance with other city-states in resistance allowed Leonidas to gather around 60,000 men in the field. On his side, Xerxes, the emperor of Persia, believed that his overwhelming numerical superiority was enough to guarantee victory. His strategy was to keep his naval fleet and infantry closely connected. The Persian infantry marched along the coast, and the Persians even dug a canal through Mount Athos to allow the ships to stay close. When the army moved inland on August 18th, 480 Emperor Xerxes had invaded Macedonia and Thessaly. His army had now reached the place called Thermopylae, a narrow pass between Thessaly and the Leon Ocean. He already knew that he could never defeat the entire Persian army, but he believed that if he could inflict a significant blow to a part of that army, The psychological damage would be such that the Persians would retreat, or in the worst case, at least delay the Persian advance enough for the city-states to organize a better defense. Not everyone was convinced that this strategy would work. Some considered it suicidal. However, the Spartan moral spirit prevailed. The only real alternative was to surrender and negotiate capitulation with the Persians, so Leonidas stuck to his decision. He and his warriors would make one last effort to keep the Persians out of their beloved town. Leonidas wanted to face the overwhelming Persian force on ground that favored him. His intention was to withdraw to the place where the Peloponnesian Peninsula joins the land of Attica. This was a very narrow strip of land, just over a kilometer long. Here he would have his men build a defensive wall behind which they would fight against Xerxes. The problem with this plan was that it left Athens and other cities without any protection. So many suggested that only a small force should be used for this plan. It was known that it would most likely never return. And Leonidas agreed. He agreed to take only a small group of his best soldiers to Thermopylae and face the Persians at the narrowest point of the pass. So Leonidas selected a force of 300 Spartans, which he himself would lead in the defense of Thermopylae. But why were only 300 chosen? And why these particular 300? 300 was suitable for an elite unit. However, the mission had a psychological purpose and was primarily meant to buy time. It was an operation destined for martyrdom. In turn, the number 300 had strong symbolic and practical connotations in Sparta, since it was the fixed number of royal bodyguards. The royal bodyguards were known as the Gepius, that is, cavalry soldiers, although in fact they served as infantry in the center of the phalanx where the commanding king would be stationed. The 300 at the forefront of Thermopylae were not only exceptionally brave and patriotic, but also highly skilled. Each one also had to have a living son. This would ensure that a son would be there to carry on his father's name. These heirs would form a new group, full of pride, to emulate the feat of their fallen ancestors. In addition to the 300 Spartans, Leonidas took about 4,000 Peloponnesians and around 1,000 non-combatant Helots. The 300 at the forefront were already determined to fight to the end. The pass of Thermopylae had a flat plain, and that was where the Persians were camped. The passage through the mountains to the sea at some points was not even 2 meters wide. At the point where the pass widened to 15 meters, the Spartans set out to repair an existing wall, making it a much more defensible place. After Xerxes' vast Persian forces arrived at the western end of the pass, they waited several days before launching their first assault. It is said that before the battle, Xerxes demanded Leonidas to surrender his weapons. The Spartan king replied with just 2 words, "Mullen lave," which translated as, "Come and take them yourself." Instead of being anxious about the upcoming attack, the Greek warriors seemed extremely calm or even excited. They busied themselves with bathing, braiding their hair, and dancing. The Persians interpreted this as signs of madness induced by fear, but a Greek who worked for them explained that this was not madness, but rather traditional practices of warriors preparing for their final battle to the death. Xerxes initially sent a force of around 2,000 men in his first assault. They wore no helmets or greaves, and their shields were made of wicker. In the narrow spaces of the pass, they couldn't take advantage of their superiority in numbers. These first forces proved to be no match for the Spartans, who defeated them without much trouble. When the Medes, the initial Persian troops, launched a rain of arrows at the defenders, in unison the Spartans raised their shields high to form a defensive roof over their heads. With every assault, hand to hand, the Spartans responded with a perfectly compact defense, with movements that were sophisticatedly orchestrated. The Medes and the ranks of troops who followed them did the best they could under the critical eye of their king, but it wasn't enough. Each attack was repelled by the Spartans, and they suffered heavy losses. The losses were so great that it is said Xerxes jumped from his throne in horror 3 times. Dismayed by the slaughter and massacre of some of his best men. Behind the protection of the restored wall, Leonidas' men held out, fighting in shifts. This clever tactic maximized their resources and their energy. Finally, towards the end of the day, Herges felt he had no choice but to send in his elite royal bodyguards, the so-called 10,000 Immortals, under the command of Gidarnus. But once again, the attack was in vain and came at the cost of heavy casualties. The bloodshed that flooded the narrow pass was overwhelming. The piles of rapidly rotting corpses grew, flies swarmed, and the stench was palpable. The battle dragged on into a second day, and still Xerxes could not make a breakthrough. By then, about 20,000 Persians had fallen at the hands of the Greek resistance. With his frustration boiling over, Xerxes finally received some good news, not because of his military superiority, but thanks to a Greek traitor. Xerxes was approached by a local resident named Ephialtes from the city of Malis, who knew the paths that crossed the mountain range very well. Ephialtes informed the king about another path through the mountain, which would allow the Persians to bypass the Greeks' defensive position. Ephialtes offered to escort up to 10,000 Persian troops through that path at night and attack the Spartans' flank. The Spartans knew about the existence of this alternative route, but they didn't know that Xerxes would receive information about it. Xerxes gave this special mission to the members of the royal guard, the Immortals, and they were led by Ephialtes. They set out silently at dusk, aided by the full moon. After a heroic climb up the mountain range of up to 1,000 meters, they reached a point where 1,000 Phocian guards were stationed, placed there by Leonidas. These troops were poorly prepared and were taken completely by surprise. On the morning of the third day of the conflict, the Persians had outflanked the Greeks. Leonidas was now between a rock and a hard place, trapped from both the rear and the front. It was at this point that Leonidas, having recognized the hopelessness of the situation, gathered his forces and ordered all troops except the Spartans to escape the place. Their cities would need those troops to keep fighting, but the 300 Spartans would fight their last battle. There at Thermopylae, as was prophesied by the oracle of Delphi there at Thermopylae. They were still very well positioned strategically to take down many Persians before taking their last breath. The Greeks would offer their last resistance, mainly outside the wall of the middle gate, which allowed them to meet the approaching enemy directly. "Tonight we will dine in hell." According to the accounts, those were the last words that Leonidas addressed to his troops before the battle. Even more than in the previous 2 days, the Spartans would give their lives, but at a very high price for the Persians. During the first stage of the battle on the third day, the Persians suffered enormous losses, even more than in the previous 2 days. The Greeks, although reduced in numbers, repeatedly pushed the Persians back, but inevitably the 10,000 members of the Persian Immortal Royal Guard emerged at the rear. Everyone fought tirelessly alongside their king, Leonidas. When Leonidas could no longer use his sword, after too many deadly blows, he used his hands and his mouth to inflict damage on the enemy. In this way, he kept fighting until his eyes saw the light of day for the last time. The exact manner of his death is not recorded, but it was reported that as soon as he fell, the Persians grabbed his body and tried to take it away. Seeing this, the Spartans rushed toward their king and tried to pull him back. Finally, the Persians unleashed a massive rain of arrows and the last Spartans were killed. Perhaps the greatest testimony to the sting caused by Leonidas's heroic defense against the Persians was the treatment of his corpse by Xerxes. Xerxes beheaded, mutilated, and crucified the Spartan king's body. Then he tried to hide the true number of casualties his men suffered during these battles. But the great defense by the Spartans could not be hidden from history. The death of Leonidas and his Spartan companions greatly boosted Greek morale, and it gave much-needed time to prepare a better defense on land, and for the Athenian fleets to also deal heavy blows to the Persians. The legend of Leonidas's heroism grew almost immediately. After the Persian army resumed its march, a group of Spartans approached the mutilated body of Leonidas to give him a proper burial. A renowned poet inscribed at the site where Leonidas and his 300 fell, "Traveler, Go to Sparta and tell the Spartans that here we lie, obeying their laws. After Thermopylae, the Persians penetrated into the heart of Greek lands, but with morale raised and a better organized army. The Greeks fought hard for a year and expelled the Persians from Hellenic lands, thus sealing the survival of their culture. It is said that in this war it was the first time that more than 20 Hellenic cities fought together. The Greeks developed for the first time a notion of themselves as a group and as a common people. Under this feat, the figure of Leonidas acquires all his greatness and significance. 4 decades after his death, another Spartan king decided to recover the mortal remains of the hero and return them to his homeland. He was given a state funeral in his city, and a burial enclosure was dedicated to him, surrounded by a stele that listed the 300 names of the fallen Spartans. Thus the myth was immortalized, the flesh and blood man who, through his will, transcended human categories. The feat of Leonidas and his 300, it not only spiritually uplifted a people who were succumbing to the Eastern Empire, but also gave them the time and breathing room they needed to reorganize. A counteroffensive that allowed Greek civilization to continue maintaining its sovereignty and independence. This was Ronaldo Carrillo speaking to you. I hope you enjoyed this video. I invite you to support us on our Patreon, which you can find below the video, to follow us on our Instagram account, and to like this video. Share it, leave your comments, and turn on the notification bell. See you next time, and God bless you.